Hello, it's Reija and welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be doing my March reading wrap-up, and I have to say that I am quite pleased with how this reading month turned out because I was able to read pretty good books during the month of March. So without further ado, let's get started. The first book I read in March was The Calculating Stars by Robinette Kowal, and I had high expectations for this book because a lot of people have really liked it, but it ended up being like a little bit better than an okay read for me. This story is an alternative history science fiction novel about what would happen if a giant meteorite struck Earth and the space program had to come to fruition in an accelerated pace because humanity needs to leave the planet because they will get wiped out by a huge climactic shift in the next 50 or 70 years or so. And the main character is a Jewish physicist and a PhD graduate called Elma York, and she is a computer or a mathematician in the space program. And she is also a pilot, and she wants to be an astronaut. And that is pretty much the gist of the story. It follows the space program as it develops after the meteorite during the 50s and early 60s, and it follows Elma's attempts to rally people to the cause of women so that women can also be accepted as astronauts and as capable of being as capable of being an integral part of the space program. But I didn't think that the book went far enough. Sure, there is blatant misogyny and sexism at play, and the book also deals a little bit with the racial struggle through the characters of Myrtle and Helen especially. But I just didn't think that in those issues it delved far enough. Elma's struggles with sexism and misogyny are very well explored, but sometimes I feel like there was only this one character who was an unrelenting asshole, and there was like his influence was what was holding women back and not the systemic sexism at play. Which, like, I wanted to see more of those grey tones, like how good people can also perpetrate sexist behavior. And a lot of the time, the people who were sexist towards Elma were actually, like, the narrative painted them as the bad guys. Whereas in Elma's husband, Jonathan, there could have been a really good example of a person who is very good but has their own biases and has their own struggles with, trying to overcome sexism and those toxic masculine traits. But Jonathan is painted as this perfect man who pretty much doesn't exist. Like, he is attentive and he listens to Elma and he automatically dismisses pretty much anyone who disagrees with Elma. And I was here like, this man is a unicorn. There is no way a man like this existed in the 50s. Like, he was so woke that he puts some of the woke men of today to shame, pretty much. It was very unbelievable. Jonathan's character put my suspension of disbelief really through the ringer because, like, yeah, I didn't like his character. He was very bland. Because he didn't have any faults, he came out as very bland. And I really liked Elma. Elma is a perfect example of a character who is kind of a cinnamon roll, a pure cinnamon roll, but she had flaws. She had biases. She had like a very white lens through which she views the world, and therefore she isn't cued in on the troubles of Helen and Myrtle, and she is constantly reminded of this, and she has to check her biases. There is no such treatment for Jonathan, and that makes them as the main two characters really imbalanced. There should have been more gray areas in both of them. And what I really wanted more of was more exploration of that racial divide and segregation, considering that this was the era of the civil rights movement. I wanted more like story points about the civil rights movement. It would have been fun if Myrtle had got a more substantial role in the story, and through her we could have seen some of the civil rights movement's involvement. But as it was now in the book, that kind of was just background dressing. And yeah, I gave this book 3.5 stars. I liked it. There were a lot of elements that I really enjoyed, but overall it just wasn't enough. It didn't go far enough, in my opinion, and it didn't push enough boundaries to really make me give it that coveted 5-star rating. Next book I read this month was Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik, and once again this was a book that I enjoyed, but it didn't quite reach the high marks for me. I really love Naomi Novik's writing style. She has a very vivid way of telling the story. Like, I can really picture how things look like and how things are meant to be in her narrative, and her characters are really expressive. And I like the way she uses POVs, because each POV she used in this book was very different. They all had their own voices, they all had their grammatical tics and kind of dialects and ways of speaking, and especially it had to do with literacy and access to education and access to privileged positions, because the characters of Miriam and Irina are both very they have this beautiful elocution and lots of fancy words. But in the case of Wanda and Stepan, they had much more simplistic uses of language, because at the start of the book, Wanda is illiterate, and you can see her growth through the complications of her language. She starts as a very kind of simple country girl who is abused, and she doesn't have access to education or anything. She is a very poor person, and that shows in how she talks and how she thinks. But when she starts working for Miriam and she learns to do math and she learns to read, the use of her language changes, and that was really interesting to see. And Naomi Novik did that perfectly. And then when her brother Stepan becomes a point of view character, you can see that same kind of language tick in him as well. So I really liked that. I really liked the differences between the POV characters. Now, I will say that this book felt like it was 3 stories that Naomi Novik wanted to tell. You have the moneylender's daughter getting abducted by Winter's king. You have the princess who has a demon for a fiancé, and you have the country girl trying to get away from an abusive father. Those are three different storylines. And truth be told, Naomi Novik manages to conjoin these stories together in a plausible way, and it works, but it kind of feels unsatisfying to me. It felt like she was buttering a piece of bread, and the bread slice was too big and she didn't have enough butter, so to speak, if you know what I mean. This book felt shallow. She didn't go far enough with the characters because she didn't have time to explore all these characters because she had so many story arcs and narrative points that had to be resolved. And that meant that a lot of these characters, when their character arcs end, they feel either rushed or they just stop completely and don't get that fully satisfactory end to their arcs. And that was a little disappointing to me. I really wanted to love this book, and it has so much going for it. You have these awesome characters, you have these themes of women helping each other and found family and fighting to step away from abusive relationships and striving to do better. And it is also about finding a place of your own. There's so much going for it, but then it stumbles in the end because there's just no way that all of those storylines could be satisfactorily resolved with the amount of pages she had to work with. So in the end, I also ended up giving Spinning Silver 3.5 stars. I enjoyed it, but there just wasn't enough. I wanted more. I wanted more resolutions. I wanted more development. And the final book that I read in the month of March was Becoming by Michelle Obama. I listened to this on audio and I really enjoyed it. Michelle Obama has a very soothing voice, and she has beautiful elocution and enunciation, and she just speaks to your heart. And it was really enjoyable to listen to her tell her own story. I especially loved the way she talked about her childhood, and the most interesting parts of the book were definitely in the beginning when she talks about growing up in Chicago and her childhood and her education and how she met her husband, Barack Obama. And I really enjoyed listening to it. I felt that I got a clearer picture of who Michelle Obama is as a person, and it was kind of fun to listen to all those snippets of her life and figuring out the puzzle that makes her as a person whole. And yeah, I will say that at the end, when Barack Obama has become president and Michelle Obama has become the first lady, the book kind of veers into textbook territory. It isn't quite as personal, and it feels like a regurgitation of various facts that I could have read on Wikipedia. It is still very beautifully told, but I just felt that those parts of the book could have used some of that more personal touch that the book had going for it in the beginning. That said, I still enjoyed it very much, and especially the last quote of the book is very worthwhile. It ties the whole book together very well. Will I listen to it again? Maybe some parts in the beginning, possibly that last quote, but it doesn't really have like reread value for me. But I really enjoyed it, so I ended up giving it 4 stars. And there you have it. Those are all the books that I read in March. Tell me in the comments if you have read any of these books. What did you think of them? Do you agree with me? Tell me down in the comments. And I will see you in the next video where I will be wrapping up all of the comics that I read during the month of March. I will see you then. Bye bye!